All right, this is going to be a quick overview of a new tool I put together. Not even so much as a new tool, but kind of the latest iteration or development of kind of a utility that I put together years ago that I've been using sort of in a side-loaded aspect just on my own. Figured I would sort of clean it up and make it a little bit more presentable, a little bit more modular, and release it to the community as an extension. And so this is sort of a productivity tool that has sort of been forged in the heat of, years of triage and incident response as sort of a way to solve a problem. And that problem is kind of this tedious, redundant nature of performing enrichment lookups on IOCs, or indicators of compromise. And so the extension here, the tool, is called IOC Recon. I probably could have come up with a better name for this, but I just sort of went the descriptive route here. We're performing reconnaissance, essentially, or threat intelligence lookups on IOCs that we come across, kind of in a context menu search that we can see here. And again, I mentioned I sort of built this as a very modular way. And so while we're going to demonstrate it and how it was initially developed as a security analysis tool or a threat intelligence tool, you'll see when we jump into the settings here that it's very adaptable to any kind of situation where you have data or a piece of text or something that you want to look up, and you can build out different regular expressions and transformations to make it more flexible for your scenario. And so let's just take a look here. Again, this is sort of the Chrome web store page. It's also available on the Firefox web store, whatever they call it, the extensions, add-ons location. And we can see some screenshots of it, but we will jump into the extension in a second. I do have it installed. That's right. So this is really saving us the time of, let me get a good example here. So I just pulled up a DFIR report here, and let's go down to the indicators of compromise. Again, we might come across IOCs in a report like this, some kind of security or threat report, or within our ticketing platform, right? Depending on what the use case is. We can see we have a number of different indicators here. Looks like we have some domains in this sort of Defang format. No problem. We can just right click on this. And why don't we do sort of the infomercial, right? This is how we did this in the old days, right? We would copy, maybe I want to look this up on VirusTotal, right? And so go over there, go under search here, paste in that indicator. And I'm pretty sure it can handle the Defang. Yep, there we go. And so now we're doing that. And then maybe now we want to take that same domain name here, and this definitely doesn't look good. We want to perform some more domain reputation checks, right? Or maybe figure out the IP address and do some IP address lookups, or, again, some whois, or, if we were dealing with maybe a file name, or we have some IPs here, right? Or things like hash values. Well, again, maybe just grab this MD5 here, paste this into VirusTotal. And now we're getting sort of that enrichment on the hash value itself. Maybe I want to look this up on some other sources as well. And so how can we save the time of having to manually do all of this based on, maybe a list of IOCs that we have? Well, this is sort of where the idea for this tool was born. So it allows us to configure any number of sources we want with sort of a URL template, right? So if we have an endpoint that we can hit, like the VirusTotal URL for its scanning or its results, or something like URL scan, or other services, we can just throw in a placeholder, right? So very similar to the Firefox Smart Search, if you've ever used that. So that's sort of our idea here. We can do GET requests or POST requests, and I'll showcase some examples of this in a second. It's going to detect, a number of different indicators. It's going to do like refanging and defanging operations, right? So you can actually just demonstrate that. So I believe we had some defang domains here, right? I can even just go up here and say, copy the refanged, and now it's going to basically strip that defanged indicator out. So now we have this sort of live thing that I definitely don't want to go to. But that's sort of the idea here. It's very configurable, as you'll see. We can do a lot of like Regex, and I'll show where that comes into play. And so I'm just going to open up the extension here. We have IOC Recon. So just clicking on that is going to show us the options page here. And so again, the sort of problem statement here is that our workflows are just a bunch of pivots, right? We might have an indicator that we want to check against 5 or 10 different services. The tools are all just URLs, right? These different like REST endpoints that just have an indicator jammed somewhere into them, right? Shutdown's a good example. We have the search query where we're just throwing in that placeholder indicator. VirusTotal, same sort of thing, and we just demonstrated. All these different sources in some way use a dynamic kind of indicator that we can inject. MITRE is an interesting example. We'll take a look at that in a second. But that's the idea here, right? Text that you select is just sort of parameterized, and each lookup service is something that you can configure with a template and a placeholder. And so let's take a look at how the virus total search works, right? So go to edit here. We have the name, right? It's just virus total search. We have the category, so you can categorize them into different things. And that's what's going to appear when you sort of go to look up here. And we have these different categories that we can run. So just threw that into threat intel. This is where we build the template, right? And we use the %s indicator. You can actually change this in the settings, and we'll look at that in a moment. But that's where we throw in the %s there, kind of like that Firefox smart keyword search. We can change the method, right? So how is the request actually sent? Obviously, this is going to be a GET request, but we can do POST requests as well, where you can throw in the actual template body in the same way. We can apply any kind of encoding, right, to the inserted value. If we want a base 64 encode it for some reason, URL encode it, it's usually a common one. And we can select what indicator types we want to apply to. And so there's a ton that are built in by default here, but you'll also see if we go to advanced, we can create our own regex if we have a very specific indicator that we're trying to match. And so again, there's a ton of flexibility here. We have some options. If we want to refang, open up in a background tab, right? So it doesn't just appear in our view. And we also have transform rules, and I'll showcase the MITRE example where this actually comes into play. We also have a test here, right? So it's just going to sort of build the result. So if I had like evilsite.com, we can see sort of how that's being built and save our source there. All right, let's take a look at some of the import and export settings, because this is where another kind of pain point that I've seen a few different tools or extensions do similar kind of things before, but they didn't have all the features I wanted. And so this is why I kind of built IOC Recon here. So our configuration here, right, all these sources and our settings are just a simple JSON file. So we can download that, or we can just copy it to the clipboard. If we want to, if we have another instance, we just want to paste in what our current settings are and sort of import all of those sources into our list, right? So it's very flexible in that way. We can upload or paste in a JSON configuration, or very importantly for teams, right, enterprise, thinking about scale here, we can do a remote sync. Right, and so we can pull sources from a remote JSON URL. And in fact, I have a sample one here in the GitHub repository. Again, this is just all the source code for the tools, if you want to take a look at it. If we go under examples here, we have this example config file, right? And this is just an example of what we would get if we downloaded or exported our JSON config file here. Just an example one of what ships with the tool. I'm just going to click on raw here to open up the raw JSON. Right, so now we just have a live link here, hosted on GitHub, for our version, right? And so what I can do is go over to remote config, paste that in, and it's just going to check. We're going to need to allow that, and there we go. Now we're syncing. We can, sync on demand if we want to, just by clicking sync now. And again, it's going to dedupe anything, so we're not going to keep adding the same results over and over. And just the very nature of loading our browser every day is going to sync essentially every day. So I decided not to have it sync and reach out every X seconds. You can do it manually if you need to, if you push an update, or again, naturally, anytime you open up the browser, it's going to pull and fetch any new changes to your config file. So if we head back to sources now, we still have 13 because it's just, I pulled in the exact same data that we've already had. It's sort of been deduplicated, right? If we go down to sync sources, we can even see that as well. And so we can see link here. So the source appears in both of our, local sources and our sync sources. And so it's just going to prefer or sort of prioritize what's in the sync. So nothing is essentially changed. But again, if I want to go in, I can disable any of these. If I add in any new local sources here, or your sources, again, that's only going to appear on my end. It's not going to affect anything on the team sort of sync, right? So this is a way that you and all your analysts can share the same kind of version-controlled document where you all have access to the same sources. All right, so that's the team sync there, something I really wanted to have in one of these tools, and it's very simple to do. We also have settings here, so this is where we can change if we want to change what that placeholder is, right? By default, it's just going to be %s, but we can make this, anything we want, right? If I want to just throw this in like sample here, and now I have to include that in all of the different sources that I create, right? So there might be cases where you want to change the %s for some reason, but that's just sort of the default behavior there. We also have some menu behavior, right? Just so how the extension actually works. We can reset to defaults. And that's pretty much it, right? It's fairly simple, but there are a lot of powerful features that I think make this a really good enterprise utility that's very simple to use. So let me showcase some of that power as well. So I'm going to delete the default MITRE attack. You can also reorder these, by the way, and that'll affect how they show up in your context menu. But in a second, I'm going to delete this and recreate it just to showcase how it was made. Let me try to find an example. Oh, so we have the MITRE attack section here. So let me highlight one of these techniques, right? Create account T1136. I'm going to right click, go up to lookup, and I can do search all matching sources, or I can go down to threat intel, where I've categorized it, and click on MITRE attack. And as expected, it's going to open up the attack URL here, right, for that technique, and it just dynamically inserted that placeholder of T1136 because that's what we had highlighted. Now, what about the sub-techniques, right? This is a big thing with MITRE attack. We have T1136002. Now, how do we deal with a dot? Because if I go up here and do a dot 001 or 002, doesn't matter, we're going to get a 404 because that's not how MITRE structures their endpoints, right? If we click on one of these, you can see it inputted that with a slash instead of a dot. And so again, I really wanted the tool, the extension here, to be flexible because this is quite common, right? There's going to be many cases where you actually need to perform some kind of transformation on what you're highlighting before you send it off to the source. And so this was very important for me to get right. And so let me demonstrate how we would create a source like MITRE attack with enough flexibility that it can work for sub-techniques. And so I'm just going to delete the initial source here and recreate it, right? So I'm going to go add source. I'll just call it MITRE attack. For the category, again, just threat intel is fine. URL template, right? And so that's where we go over to the website or the threat intel source, paste in our URL and say, hey, this is where we need to insert the placeholder. And it'll warn you if you don't have that placeholder in. And so let me just do %s there. Perfect. We can even do a backslash there just to be safe. For the method, obviously, it's going to be a GET request in this case because we're just inputting that URL parameter. Not even parameter, just the URL itself. For encoding, I'll just set that to none. For applying to indicator types, this is where we want to have some custom regex here, right? We could do any, and it'll just mean it'll show up for anything. If we were to do lookup account, search all matching sources, we'll always pull up MITRE in that case, which isn't ideal because, again, if we think about what MITRE techniques look like, well, this is sort of the character set we would use, right? Or with the dot for sub-techniques. And so we can create some custom regex here to essentially give us that flexibility. And so I'm going to open up the advanced matching and transformations here, and we're going to set a custom match pattern using regex. And this placeholder here is the actual pattern that I want to use. I just used it as a placeholder to show you an example. But this is going to match those MITRE IDs, right? So if I go to regex 101, I can paste in that expression, right? And then I can just start pasting in some different MITRE attack techniques, right? And we can see we do get those match groupings. Right? If I were to just do the single sort of main technique there, we're still getting a match. If I were to do sub-techniques, we also get a match. If I try to do a sub-technique of a sub-technique, well, that's not a thing, right? So this is a pretty good pattern that we can use to match in these cases. So I will save that as the match pattern there. For the flags, this is where we can, again, do some of those regex case insensitivity or global or multi-line. I'll just set it to ignore case there. Now for the transform rules, this is where we want to apply some logic that says, hey, when we see a dot, right, in a technique, change that to be a slash so we can actually hit the endpoint. So I'm going to add a rule here to find a backslash with a dot, right? We need to escape out the dot there. And we're going to replace those dots just with a slash. All right, these transforms are just a find and replace with regex that runs on our selection before it builds the URL. All right, so find a dot, replace it with a slash, and now the ID gets reshaped into exactly what is expected on the MITRE website. And so we can preview to make sure it works here, right? So if I were to just type in T1059.001, we can see how that URL was transformed, and it did so correctly. Perfect, so I'll just save the source there, head back to our example here. And so now if I highlight, look it up with threat intelligence, of course that's going to work. That's just the main technique. Let's try to look up a sub-technique now. Right, so here's a good one, domain account. Do the same thing. Go down to threat intelligence, MITRE attack, and there we go. It worked perfectly. Awesome. And so That's essentially IOC recon, right? It turns that copy-paste pivot grind that I'm sure many of us are used to into kind of this single right-click context window view, right? It understands our indicators. It can refang and defang indicators. It's very customizable and modular, as we saw. And so if that fits your sort of workflow and how you like to work, I think it would be a great addition. Feel free to use it, extend it, feel free to build out features, submit pull requests, right? It's completely open source, and hope you enjoy.